It's dedicated to the principle, the prospect, that all men and all women that are Americans are created free and equal. And those of us in uniform, we are dedicated to that principle, and we're willing to die for it. So if we're willing to die for it, we ought to be willing to live for it. And I can tell you that we in uniform are exactly that, willing to live for it every single day, day in and day out. We represent all that's good about America when we are a cohesive, united force, and a force for good and a force for steadiness both domestically and internationally. And I, for one, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I know I speak for all the Joint Chiefs, that I could not be more proud of what our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen are doing day in and day out in some really difficult circumstances. And I'm going to turn it over to the SEAC. But thanks so much for what all of you do every single day.
Thanks, Chairman. SEAC?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have been 7 months now in the position of the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman, and in those 7 months, we continue our sensing sessions to make sure that we address all institutional issues. As the Secretary mentioned, this week we took the first concrete step towards an enduring commitment to ensure diversity and inclusion in our department, and that is with the DoD Diversity and Inclusion Board, which I co-lead with Secretary of the Air Force Barrett and Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, Matthew Donovan. So we acknowledge that there is a problem, and we're willing to go anywhere from cradle to grave to make sure that we address all of the issues that are plaguing your institutions, your particular units, and personnel to make sure that we do not get it wrong. And we want to make sure that at the end of the day, once we identify the root causes, we place those plans into action to ensure that everybody serving is valued for their talent, abilities, and experiences. That is our promise to you. And that is based on the principle of the Constitution, like General Milley brought up, that we are all created equal. And equality and opportunity are the founding principles for our Constitution. So we look forward to keep hearing from you. Lastly, we want to make sure that we recognize that we are on this together. And biologically, there's only one race, and that is the human race. It covers all of us. Let's embrace each other. Let's go ahead and get after the nation's missions to ensure freedom and ensure that we, once again, serve as a model for society. So thank you, and let's go ahead and take their questions, sir.
Thank you, SEAC.
Right. Thank you, sirs. Well, welcome to another live town hall from the Pentagon briefing room. I'm Commander Morgan Murphy. We asked for questions from around the force and the general public on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and hundreds of you submitted not only your questions, but videos as well. So in addition to written questions for our three senior leaders today, we'll be seeing recorded, unscripted messages straight from military members around the world. Let's get right into it. The first question this afternoon was submitted via Twitter by Kate Wright of Los Angeles, California. She writes, "Thank you for defending freedom of navigation. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and why?" Well, freedom of navigation is a tough question right out of the box. I'll turn to the Secretary of Defense for an answer.
Good. Thank you, Commander. And thank you, Kate, for that question. It's a very good question. Freedom of navigation is very important. First, as a principle that says that you as an individual, as a country, have the freedom to navigate either by air, by sea, without being threatened or impeded, if you will, by others. It's an important principle that underlies international law and the rules and norms that have helped keep the prosperity and security of the United States and many countries now for over 7 decades. It's also important because without freedom of navigation, you don't have freedom of commerce. And when you think about it, over 80% of the world's trade occurs on the oceans of the world, and not just in the Pacific, well, mostly in the Pacific, but all around the world. It could be goods, it could be in the Persian Gulf. It is the free flow of oil that fuels many economies. But the freedom of navigation is very important. That's why our United States Navy, now since its inception, has defended the freedom of navigation so that we would have that freedom of commerce and so that other countries would respect those laws and norms that are out there. That's why also the United States Navy faithfully, dutifully, expertly conducts what are called freedom of navigation operations in contested waters around the world, whether it's in the South China Sea, it could be in our hemisphere, or it's also in the EUCOM AOR or the CENTCOM area of responsibility. These things are important to defend. They are important to stand up to and to assert, because the minute you don't, they get chipped away. And over time, what you do is you lose that principle. Those laws and rules and norms are eroded, and you find yourself in a less free world that inevitably ends up being less prosperous and less secure.
Our second question today was submitted by 19-year-old Tamon Hamlet in Houston, Texas. Tamon is a member of the ROTC and asks, quote, will the U.S. military focus on more humanitarian efforts to alleviate the harm caused by COVID? If so, how? Tamon, I'm going to turn your question over to the highest-ranking uniformed member of the Armed Forces to answer, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley.
Well, it's a great question, Timon, and thanks for that. As you know, with respect to COVID, for the U.S. military, our priority is first to protect the force. And the reason we put that first is because our theory of the case is that if the force is not healthy, then we can't do all the other tasks like protect the American people, either internationally or domestically. So the first thing we have to do is to make sure that our force itself, the troops, the ships, the planes, and those that man them are clean, COVID-free. So the Secretary has instituted a whole series of very, very rigorous rule sets that we've been following now for several months. And thankfully, we've been, and I knock on wood every day, but thankfully we've maintained that discipline, and we have, relative to other parts of the society in the world, we have relatively low rates of infection. So we've learned a lot over the last several months, but we've got to protect the force. Secondly, we've got to protect the readiness, because our number one mission is to protect the Constitution, protect the country from any enemies, foreign and domestic sort of thing. So that's the primary role of the U.S. military. So maintaining the readiness of the force is key, and that includes the health of the force. And then lastly, we're going to work as part of and in support of a whole of government approach. So right now, as many know, we, the Department of Defense, are in support of other agencies in combating this scourge of the COVID-19 virus. We've been very effective at it. We've been greatly in support with our ships, the Comfort, for example. Our doctors and nurses, our hospitals, et cetera, have been deployed all over the United States and internationally. So we'll continue to do that in support of other agencies. So the force protection piece is critical. The readiness piece is critical. And then lastly, we're in support of the other agencies. And we're going to continue to do that as we have been, and we'll do that under the direction of Secretary of Defense. So thanks for the question, Timon.
The third question comes from Peter Hu from Alabama. Peter asks, sir, do you believe the integrity of the colonel's promotion selection process and being close hold was compromised politically and by the media? I'll turn this question over to Dr. Esper.
No, thank you. It's a good question. Look, I believe in the integrity of all of our promotion processes, regardless of rank. We apply stringent standards, of course, to this to ensure its integrity. But we also follow all applicable laws and regulations, policies, and practice and precedent. So I'm very confident in the integrity of our board processes. We protect the privacy of individuals, and we go to great extent to make sure it's fair and it's sound, and the processes can hold up the scrutiny of any type of inquiry or any type of look in terms of how the process is conducted. So I think everybody out there who is being looked at now for promotion or who has gone through a board should have full faith and confidence that the chain of command, military and civilian, will ensure and upkeep the integrity of that process. That's what we owe our service members.
Thank you, sir. Given the events of 2020 and the Secretary's charge to the Department on diversity, we solicited video messages from the force so we could hear from you directly. This first story and question is from Senior Airman Naomi Sims of the U.S. Air Force. Let's roll the video.
Hello, my name is Senior Airman Naomi Sims of the 177th Fighter Wing in New Jersey. I was recently in a meeting where my leadership acknowledged the importance of addressing some of the social issues we're all experiencing. They opened the floor for conversation and feedback, but there was very little participation in that setting. I actually did have ideas, suggestions, and even some critical feedback to improve things around the unit, but I remained silent and frustrated. After sharing my frustration with an entrusted chief, I was encouraged to go as far as to speak with the command chief of our wing. In my personal experience as a Black woman in the Air Force, I have felt the pressure to conform and not cause any waves surrounding the subject of race. so I was undeniably nervous to share my perspectives and ideas with leadership. However, I am proud to report that my leaders were incredibly receptive and open to my feedback. Those conversations sparked a lot of much needed dialogue about topics that people so often shy away from. Being given the space to understand and be understood was extremely impactful for me, and I feel that others would benefit from it as well. With that being said, does the military have any plans to facilitate more opportunities for productive and informative dialogue around other bases?
Mr. Secretary, your thoughts on her comments?
Oh, it's a great insights, great comments. I thank her for sharing them. She's spot on. I got to tell you, over the past 3 weeks, I've held well over half dozen listening sessions all around the country and overseas with soldiers and sailors and airmen of all ranks and of all races and ethnicities. And the SEAC has joined me on many of those. In fact, we just held one yesterday at a naval facility down in Virginia. And what she is saying is the same story we hear over and over and over again, and that is the importance of having that conversation and the difficulty in initiating it. And I know the SEAC and I have both taken this same note over and over again, which is why in that first action memo that we put out last week, one of the things that I wrote in there is the importance of giving our folks the lexicon, the words, the definitions to start talking about things like discrimination and racism and prejudice, get people comfortable with the terms, and then help teach practices, whether it ranges from interventions to having the conversation, because they're very difficult conversations. We've sat in them. I've sat in them now several times with well over 100 service members and had these. And what she is saying is spot on. I think once you get in a group and you can get over that initial reluctance to have that conversation, people really start talking, and you get great insights into their experiences, their perceptions, and that's where it has to happen. That's where it begins, where you really start breaking down the problem and getting, not just sharing experiences, but then getting towards solutions. So we've put some of this in the memo, the action memo coming out. I put out word to commanders, to leaders of all grade and all the services that you got to have these conversations, you got to facilitate them, and you just got to be able to have that discussion. People want to talk, and we got to be able to listen as well. So I hope this is something that commanders not only hope but should do across the force. I'm glad that she raised it, and it's because it's very important. That's where it has to begin, at that level, to begin those discussions, and then we got to facilitate it from the top down as well, so that we open up that space for folks to have that discussion. If you don't mind, I'll invite the SEAC, because he's been my battle buddy, if you will, on this journey, and see what he wants to share.
No, thank you, Mr. Secretary. So first of all, teammate, thank you so much for bringing that up to us, because like the Secretary said, this is something that has been common throughout our travels. The one thing that I have learned from all of this so far is that adversity continues to bring opportunity, and this is yet another opportunity for us to get our wrongs right. Conforming is not the way for anyone out there serving in the Department of Defense. We should all be valued for what we bring to the table. But in order to do this, we have to talk about it more and more. And I will say that the more we talk to the troops, the more comfortable we are addressing the issue. It's coming natural, but repetition is going to be your champion. You have to be able to put it out there, be transparent, and go ahead and continue the conversation up and down the chain to be able to get after the root causes of the problem. And then that's going to lead to the most important thing that we can do on this, and that is to measure our progress. Then we're going to go ahead and start looking at the facts and the data to make sure that we're marching in the right direction. But it takes people like you, courageous enough to voice your opinions, your concerns to your leaders, and then walk the rounds up to the target, up the chain, to ensure that your voice is heard. You do that, we have your back 100%.
Let me just wrap up by saying this is about two important things. One is showing empathy and respect for one another. And then number two, related to that, is what we're trying to do is build a more cohesive, a more capable, a more ready force. At the end of the day, we get there by working with our most critical resource, our people, and making sure that everybody feels included, and making sure everybody feels welcome and comfortable and confident in what they're doing, and ensuring that diversity, inclusion, and equal opportunity, because that's how we become even better than what we are today.
Courageous indeed. Thank you, sir. This next question comes from Matthew Kirshner, an Army automotive maintenance warrant officer from Junction City, Kansas. Via Facebook, he asked, what's the annual cost and actual benefits to prove to foreign nations that we can deploy brigades rapidly? Instead of wasting funds on brigade rotations costing hundreds of millions annually in taxpayer dollars just to ship equipment, not to mention personnel, repair parts, ammunition, etc., why don't we use that funding to actually fix our readiness? Because units are flat out lying to the JCS in order to make a mission happen just to get a good evaluation bullet. Modernize our equipment sets. Last I checked, I was still working on equipment nearly 40 years old with issues 4 pages long. Matthew, I'm going to turn your question over directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to answer. Sir, your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Matthew, for the comment. I'm gonna give you a call, though. I want to find out the equipment that's 40 years old. I got 40 years in the military. I'm hoping you're not working on stuff 40 years old if you're in the Army. There's ships out there that are 40 years old. There's airplanes, but I'm going to give Matthew a quick call here. I want to find out about that equipment. But having said that, there is a logic to why we do what we do in terms of rotating forces. And we do. We rotate brigades to Korea, for example. We rotate brigades to Europe. And we've got to be able to do both. We've got to be able to fix and maintain our equipment here at home station or overseas. But we also have to project power. The United States is a unique global power in that we have a friendly country to our north and our south, and we have oceans to our east and our west. And for us to be a global power and influence outcomes around the world and to shape outcomes in the interest of the United States, we've got to be able to project power. So that's why we do it. And in order to do that, we have to rotate forces on a very, very frequent basis in order to stretch out the muscle memory, if you will, of the sea and air lift to get forces, heavy forces or light forces across the oceans and overseas and get them into exercises and training and so on. Yes, we have been doing that now for 20 years on a scheduled basis or so into Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But it's one of those things that if you don't continually practice it and train at it, then it will atrophy over time, and it doesn't take long for that to atrophy. So we need to continue rotations forward in order to fulfill the tenets of the National Defense Strategy in order to maintain our commitments overseas. And at the same time, we need to maintain all that equipment. And Matthew, I'll give you a call here. I want to find out about the 40-year-old equipment that you're working on, and then maybe I can do something with the Secretary of Defense and get you some new equipment. But thanks for the question. Great question.
Look out, Matthew. Our sixth question today comes from Salvatore Corelli of Stamford, Connecticut. He asks, how did the United States fall so far behind Russia and China in terms of nuclear modernization and hypersonic technology? Mr. Secretary, would you care to answer this question on nuclear readiness?
Sure, and I appreciate Salvatore's question. Let me just, though, challenge the premise up front. I can assure Salvatore that we have the most ready, capable forces out there, bar none. And the fact is we are upgrading them and modernizing our bomber force, our ICBM force, and our submarine force. And they will not just be more capable than our competitors and adversaries today. They will be even more capable than that as we modernize them. So, and there's more to it than that. We have to also update and modernize our nuclear command and control and communications. But we are putting a lot of money into this. It's important to continue to modernize and recapitalize the nuclear deterrent because of what it is. That second word I mentioned, deterrent. Because what it does, if you have a very capable triad, you're able to deter conflict. You'll be able to deter threats to the United States. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to do. We want to deter conflict. We want to deter war. And failing that, we want to be prepared to fight and win. But I can assure Salvatore and anybody else there that's interested in this issue is we maintain a highly capable nuclear triad, more capable than our adversaries and competitors. And we will continue to maintain that overmatch in the years ahead.
Next, we have another video message. This one is from Lance Corporal Pham from Des Moines, Iowa. Just as a reminder, like our questions, these are real videos from around the force. In this one, there's a lot of background noise, and in true Marine fashion, it sounds like there's heavy armor rolling through at one point. So to make it easier for our online audience to follow along, we've added subtitles. Otherwise, it's just as she submitted it. Let's roll it.
My name is Lance Corporal Pham from Des Moines, Iowa. I'm here to tell you about my experiences regarding inclusion and diversity in the Marine Corps. 2 years ago, before I signed the papers, I was encouraged not to join by other service members and veterans because of my background as a female and a minority. I was told that I'd be attacked from both angles because of this. However, I accepted the risk and joined anyway, and upon coming to this unit, I was proven wrong. I was welcomed with open arms by people of all sorts of backgrounds regarding race, religion, ethnicity, culture. It did not matter. We're all bonded by the same standards and the same willingness to perform our duties. However, other service members might not have had the same luck I've had with this wonderful group of brothers and sisters and good leadership who enforce inclusion. They might feel hindered or disrespected because of their backgrounds. I plan on progressing my career in order to trample exclusion and encourage inclusion. I appreciate this opportunity as one to encourage those who feel that they can't choose their own career or path because of their backgrounds, to accept the risk and go for it anyway, because the Corps, along with the rest of the world, is moving towards the path of inclusion and diversity, making progression, and anybody can be a part of that movement. Thank you.
SEAC Colon Lopez, do you want to comment on Lance Corporal Pham's message?
Absolutely. I mean, things like that just get you motivated every time. So I want to thank the Lance Corporal for her courage and ownership of the issue, first of all. This is somebody that I can assimilate with because I too am a minority, and I was told about my limitations before I even tried to do anything. And it was all about proving people wrong, but that took action. When we look at minorities progressing to the ranks, we need to make sure that everyone has the same opportunities, regardless of who they are. And then if they excel, then so be it, open the door. And if they don't, provide them either the training or another opportunity to go ahead and move forward or validate their limitations. But I will tell you that she is doing exactly what every single member of the Department of Defense should be doing, trampling diversity and inclusion, or promoting it. And diversity and inclusion are nothing more than a quality control mechanism for us, the Department of Defense, to benefit from the talents of everyone in our rank and file. So we need to embrace that. So for everyone listening right now, I believe that Lance Corporal Pham just gave you a vector. Dust off your map and compass and start marching on.
All right. The next question comes from Rosemary Helton, who works for the Pentagon Force Protection Agency. She asked, quote, with the pending memo on OPSEC and CUI, how do you see it impacting not only DOD, but the federal government as a whole? Mr. Chairman, sir, your views on operational security and controlled unclassified information.
I'm sorry, I need to jump in here before the chairman answers because
I was just about to jump on that.
I just want to commend Rosemary for her fine choice of sports teams, the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know it's a very astute question. I'm sure the...
I think since the Secretary wrote the memo, the Secretary can continue with the answer to the question, since it's from the Pittsburgh Steelers. But Rosemary, thanks. Thanks for the question. And I will let the Secretary answer the question. But from my point of view, operational security is critical, and it always has been, always will be. And no matter what labels we put on it, whether it's classified, CUI, FOUO, secret, top secret, all these code words, et cetera, the couple of things to remember about operational security. One is whoever you're talking to with information, they need to have the appropriate level of clearance. Don't ever forget that. So you might be talking to someone about something. They may not have the level of clearance about the topic you're talking about. Secondly, even if they have the appropriate clearance, they need to have a need to know. So that's important. You have to have both things when you're talking classified information. Operational security is critical. And there's been leaks, so there's things that are water cooler talk, and people talk about me, or they talk about the Secretary, or they talk about this person on the SEAC, or that person, other people, et cetera. Okay, that's water cooler talk. And that's going to happen. Large organizations, Pentagon, military, et cetera. But we do have to guard classified information. We have to guard it very, very closely. Leaks of classified information are matters of life and death. Not only is it matters of life and death for us in uniform, but the sources of that classified information oftentimes are human beings. It's not all signals intelligence. Sometimes there's human involved, and there's human beings out there who are collecting critical information. If that information is inadvertently let out, it appears in a newspaper, on TV, or a blog site, or something like that, foreign intelligence services, adversary foreign intelligence services can piece that together, and they can go right back to they can figure out the source or the method, and then they can compromise that. That has happened before. with the United States. On the flip side, we have to balance that against transparency, because we do have a requirement to be transparent with the American people, and we want to ensure that we explain ourselves adequately and fully, because we're a very expensive organization, one of the most expensive organizations in the world, if not just the country. And the taxpayer is funding us to a great degree, and in order to justify the expenses that we are as a military, we need to be transparent, and the medium of doing that is the media. And things like this, a town hall, et cetera. But we have to always keep a balance there between classified information, official information, information that might be sensitive, and the transparency aspect. And it takes a high degree of thought to do that. And I'll let the Secretary talk further about it, but that's kind of my view on it. So thanks, Rosemary. Despite your allegiance to the Steelers, it's a great question.
Well, Rosemary is clearly a very intelligent person with superb judgment, and she knows the importance of this issue. And I'll just footstop what the chairman just said. I mean, think about it in terms of the national defense strategy. If you're releasing classified or sensitive information, what you're doing is undermining line of effort number one in terms of impacting our lethality and the readiness of the force. In fact, I'll go so far as to say you're not only jeopardizing a mission, but you could be jeopardizing soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who are on the front lines. That's number one. Number two is the leak of that type of information also jeopardizes our alliances and partnerships. It jeopardizes our foreign policy, our national security strategy, because leaks undermine those bonds. Countries come not to trust us. Allies doubt whether we can keep a secret or we could share something sensitive between us. So you got to think about it in those terms, and it really matters. We all know the phrases from World War II, right? Loose lips sink ships. That's true today as well. And maybe in some ways there's even much more at risk, because we live in a world where it's not just where we're not just talking or on the phone, but we're on cyber. We have people are trying to compromise the integrity of our networks, of the internet, of our cyber capabilities. So we got to be very careful in what we say and do. And we have to avoid, and certainly, any type of release of classified information or secure information. But there's also information that is unclassified that can be sensitive as well, that, again, can undermine those things that I just spoke about. So I appreciate Rosemary's question.
We received the next question via Twitter from Paul Schrum in Raleigh, North Carolina. Paul notes he's not in the military, but wanted to know, quote, regarding the Bonhomme Richard fire, are you investigating the possible causes of the fire? Secretary Esper, would you care to comment on the tragic fire aboard the USS Bonhomme Richard?
Sure. It very much is a very tragic fire. I'm pleased to report that the fire is out. I've been in touch with the Secretary of the Navy, and I get reports from the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. So the fire is out. The CNO is out there today, and the Navy will be conducting an investigation, and that's the right thing to do, of what happened. But they're also going to conduct a survey of the ship and assess the damage. And then thirdly, I think they've done very smartly, is to reach out to the rest of the fleet and to speak to the commanders and make sure that the commanders have all the resources they need, that the sailors are trained, and that they are practiced in terms of firefighting. So we are proactive. They are proactive, trying to stay in front of things in case there's another, to avoid a fire on any other ship. So it's, firefighting on a ship is very dangerous. It's a very demanding thing. I recently traveled to Great Lakes, where we train our sailors, our new sailors coming in, and very impressed by the training they do up there. It's live training in terms of putting out fires. It's that important to the safety and security, integrity of a ship and the crew, that you know how to fight fires. And I really applaud the Navy's efforts to put the fire out, to begin an investigation, and then proactively reach out to the rest of the fleet and make sure that they are taking all precautionary measures until we can better understand what happened on the Bonhomme Richard, to make sure we're preventing anything happening elsewhere.
We have another video message. This one is from Sergeant First Class Jonathan Fayette of the United States Army. Because of our time constraints here today and the fact we want to hear from many voices, Sergeant, I'll let you know that we cut your video slightly for length, but not for content. Let's roll the video.
My name is Jonathan Fayette. I'm the First Sergeant for Bravo Company, 47th Combat Support Hospital, and I'd like to tell my story. I'm from Nigeria originally. My family moved here when I was 5 years old. And I pretty much grew up in the Midwest, Michigan area. Kalamazoo is the city that I primarily grew up in. Ever since I was little from watching the videos way back in the 80s of Be All You Can Be, and for commercials that the Army produced, I've always wanted to join the military. So I'm literally living my dream by being a first sergeant. I've had nothing but positive experiences since I joined the Army. Since I'm a 68 Whiskey by trade combat medic, I've been able to be in a myriad of units, whether it's light infantry to some special operations units as well. In doing that, I've had opportunities where I was the single only African American in the organization to one of two to multiple. And like I said, my experience has been positive. Going in some of those units, there's been soldiers who necessarily didn't work with personnel of my complexion growing up, and they had some biases from their upbringing. But we all bleed the same color, and to this day, they're my lifelong friends. I was able to change their perspectives just by daily interactions with them and working with them, turning wrenches with them in the multiple or ruck marches or doing PT, and now they're, like I said, my lifelong friend. I've also had experiences where I've been in cities where my family was concerned because historically those areas were not very receptive to people of my complexion and skin color as well. I was OCT and JRTC, and when I told my parents that I was going to JRTC, they were like, "You need to be careful because there's racist activity down there and things of that nature." But when I got there with my wife, who is Caucasian, and all my kids are mixed, I got down there and found that was not the case. You know, the people in that area were extremely receptive to us. We had no issues when we were on about around town, and we have friends that continue to contact us to this day and find out where we are in our military careers. And I think all of that is due to just the military culture as a whole, especially in the cities where the military is ingrained in that area, and they are patriotic Americans who just love the personnel that are in the military and what we do for our nation, and the fact that we chose to serve our country and we're defending the Constitution, and that we all chose to raise our right hand for the betterment of our country as a whole. So primarily, my experiences have been great, and I've seen that my junior soldiers are also having similar experiences. Some of them have not had as great experience as I have, but they see that what they're doing is for a purpose and for a just cause, which is allowing those personnel who feel differently to be able to voice their opinions without fear of reprisal from as they might find in other countries. If there's a question that I could ask, it would be in lines with the redaction of the DA photos for boards. Is there a possibility that the names could also be redacted because with a name, basically the gender and possibly race of that soldier would be prevalent to the board members? Is that something that's also being considered?
I'll turn this one over to the SEAC for comment.
First Sergeant, first of all, thank you. I got to spend 3 years and a couple of months in United States Africa Command, and I spent quite a bit of time in your former stomping grounds. And, you know, it's very fulfilling, and it's such a proud moment to hear somebody like you that didn't come into freedom appreciate exactly what the American way of life is all about. And I also like to point out that many people that are born into freedom sometimes take it for granted. So I appreciate you putting that into perspective on how you can compare two different systems and how you have been able to thrive on this. When it comes to the names and the possibility of redacting certain information, we're taking a very holistic look on the way that boards can look at packages by virtue of merit into promotion. And that is looking at character, demonstrated abilities and credibility of personnel based on their actions to be able to go ahead and pick the best person for the best duty. And I know that the secretary and the chairman both agree that we can do better when it comes to those boards. But also we want to make sure that once we implement a system, that is something that is going to benefit you and that it's not going to hinder your opportunities for promotion. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for the comment for highlighting that all blood runs red. And that is something that we can also not take for granted. And lastly, one thing that I will close with is that there are many parents right now that are concerned about the safety of their children, specifically black families. They have brought this up to us, that they have to talk to them about putting their hands up, make sure that if a cop approaches you, the way to act and everything else. But that is a product of the history that we have endured over many years. What we need to look at now is, as we're collecting our thoughts, is for the opportunity to create a different narrative to where families, regardless of color, race, creed, nationality, are able to step out of their front doors into free America and feel safe. So again, First Sergeant, thank you, and I look forward to crossing paths with you. You're definitely an impressive soldier.
Mr. Secretary, would you like to
Yeah,
weigh
I'd just
in?
like to add, I'd like to thank the First Sergeant for sharing what a great American story. It's just fantastic. And for him now to be serving in the United States military as a First Sergeant, over 20 years, and I assume at this point in time. So it's a great story, and he tells a great tale, and it is reassuring in so many ways. And I want him to know that we are trying to root these practices out that might enable unconscious bias and things like that. So we are getting rid of the photos, and in fact, the directive I signed this week also tasks our personnel and readiness directorate, if you will, to go out and come back, I think, within 45 or 60 days and present a plan by which we could also strike references to names, references to gender, things like that that may trigger unconscious bias. So we're on that. We appreciate what that means, and the importance is to making sure that it's a merit-based system and solely a merit-based system.
Many of you didn't pose questions, but made comments, and yes, we read your comments too. Debbie Hoover, via Facebook, posted on our call for town hall questions. She wrote, quote, "What is wrong with you, DOD? Why are you discussing these problems in an open forum where all of our enemies can see all of the problems of the military? It's the same you having meetings on Zoom." I'll pose Debbie's question to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Sir, do you think we should be discussing our problems as a force in an open forum like this?
I mean, it depends on the problem. For most of the things we're discussing today, absolutely yes. We all militaries are a reflection of their society, and we are a democracy, a representative democracy where people have freedom of speech, and so on. And we, the Department of Defense, we're costing the taxpayer $700 billion, $800 billion, depending on the year, which is a lot of money. And we have a very, very important job for the American people, which is to protect the common good of the Constitution and the freedoms that people enjoy. And there has to be accountability. And so you have to be transparent with the good and the bad. And you have to do that. And we as a nation demand that. We demand accountability. We demand it through the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee. Sometimes those things are uncomfortable, but the Secretary and I and all the representatives, senior leaders of the military, we must appear. And we do so under oath, and we must be candid and honest. And that's fair. That's as it should be. Those are the people's representatives, and they must hold us accountable. That's part of the deal. The media, it's embedded in that document called the Constitution, a free media, and they have a right. It's not just some nefarious idea out there. It's a right to challenge us in the military or the Department of Defense or the government as a whole in order to hold us accountable. That's important. That's an important and healthy thing for a democracy. And yes, not everything's perfect on a day-to-day basis in the Department of Defense or anywhere else in the federal government, right? But we must be transparent with the American people within the bounds of classification. If we think for a minute that something is classified and it's going to, and the revelation of that information, will do harm to a future operation or place the soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guardsman at risk or place sources and methods at risk, then we don't talk about it. But that, relative to the whole, that type of information is relatively small compared to the whole. We get criticized frequently and a lot, but that is the nature of a democracy. So yes, Debbie, thanks for the question, but I do think that it's important, and that transparency is an indicator of strength, not of weakness. And if our enemies see that, then they're witnessing strength, not weakness.
Our next question comes to us from Senior Master Sergeant Rihanna Blake with the 366th Fighter Wing at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho. She writes, quote, "In the current COVID-19 environment and considering most deployed location requirements to have inbound personnel quarantined for a 14-day period, has there been any discussion of adjusting RDDs, that's requirement drive developments, to reflect this requirement on the front end rather than having personnel that are slotted to redeploy on an automatic basis? Doing so would allow redeployers to head home more or less as scheduled while also accounting for any home station quarantine requirements, R&R, PCS orders, etc. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'll turn this one to the Secretary.
Sure. Well, I'll kind of answer the question more broadly first, and that is, we talked about it earlier. First and foremost, priority number one for me, going back to January, which is, I think, when we issued our first force protection measure in January, and since then we've issued 10, 11, 12 more, is protect our people. And protect our people means not just service members, but also family members and our DoD contractors and, of course, our DoD civilians. And by doing that, you can then take care of mission number two, priority number two, and that is make sure we maintain our mission readiness, our capabilities. And then, because that is our core mission, number one, protect the nation. And then, of course, number three is priority number three was the participate in the whole government response to COVID. But with regard to this particular issue, what we try to do is be very clear as either units move back and forth or people move back and forth, that in addition to testing and other measures that we are taking, that certainly if you are a unit, we want units before they deploy abroad to be tested and to have their ROMs, their quarantines, if you will, here on this side in the United States, so that once they hit the ground, they are ready immediately to begin their mission, whether it's a security mission, whether it's a partner operation or some type of exercise. They're ready and they don't have to wait 14 days. In many ways, that principle holds true for individuals that are PCSing back and forth. And as best as possible, all persons should go. I shouldn't say as best as possible. Let me be clear. All persons should do a 14-day ROM, either on this end or on the receiving end, depending on what you have to do in between there in terms of transportation. So that's what we're trying to get to. We want to make that system as efficient as possible. We are giving the services some room within their systems of moving people around to do it as efficiently as possible to address some of the issues being raised there. But the important thing is that we move people safely, that they do whatever testing or temperature checks as need be, and then on either one end or the other, they do that ROM so that they are not, if they are asymptomatic carriers or even symptomatic carriers, they are not presenting that into what would otherwise be a clean environment. So again, it's force protection, protecting our service members, our civilians, et cetera. And we'll raise these issues and take a look at any other way that we can either improve the policy or make it more efficient.
Today's last video submission comes from Operations Specialist First Class Pierre, who is stationed in Italy. Let's roll it.
With all the recent events that's been going on back in the States, I had to ask myself a simple question. What does my chain of command see in me when I take off this uniform? Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. But what I am is unapologetically black. And with that comes a great responsibility to face challenges and adversities of preconceived notions and prejudices of how I'm supposed to act or what I'm supposed to do. It's sad to say, racism is alive and well around the world and not just back at the States. With my experience in the Navy, although it's been a great one, I ran into some people that only judge me by the color of my skin and not by the quality of my work. As a Navy, I feel that we should continue to treat people fairly based off their character and the sum of their actions. That's how we'll continue to be the world's greatest Navy.
I'll turn this one over to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to comment on OS1 Pierre's message, sir.
Well, Specialist Pierre, thanks. Those are powerful words. You asked what your chain of command would think when you take that uniform off. I can't speak for every officer and NCO out there, but you and I, you're a sailor 24/7. Whether you're wearing that uniform or not, I'm a soldier 24/7, all the time, every time, no matter what. And that you are unapologetically black, that's a good thing. You should never deny who you are, no matter who you are, no matter how you identify. And you should be proud of that. Be proud of being a sailor. Be proud of being an African American, and all that's good. And remember, and this is for everyone, not just Pierre, but again, going back to the oath, going back to the idea that is America, the idea that every one of us is free and equal. Remember the words of Lincoln, that this is a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, and I would add all women, are created equal, period, full stop. And that's what we're about. That's what that Constitution, that's what that idea is about. And we are all free and equal. It doesn't matter where we're from. It doesn't matter the color of our skin. We're going to be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, like Martin Luther King said. That is what this country is about. That's the essence of America. And that is what we in uniform are dedicated to protect and defend. That's what the Constitution's all about. And we are willing to die for those principles, those values. And again, if we're willing to die for those principles, we ought to be willing to live for them every single day. So thanks, Specialist Pierre, for what you do and what you do every single day, whether you're wearing that uniform or not. Thanks for what you're doing and who you are.
Thank you. We have time for just a few closing comments, and I'll call on the SEAC first.
Thank you again, sir. And again, Chairman, Mr. Secretary, thank you again for this opportunity. One thing that I learned a long time ago is the Special Operations Force is truth number one, and that is that humans are more important than hardware. Well, guess what? We are those humans, and we need to treat each other with dignity and respect to make sure that we carry out that mission. For my shipmate, Pierre, I will tell you that those who judge what they don't know are nothing more than fools, so don't listen to them. You don't have to. You know your worth and you know your value. I know that. Lastly, I will leave you with two thoughts. That only the mediocre are always at their best, so we need to continue to improve. And lastly, that you deserve what you tolerate. So don't ignore things and don't walk past the issues. Deal with them head on and prevent them from happening ever again. Thank you for your time. I look forward for the next opportunity.
General?
Thanks. I just, at the risk of repeating myself over and over and over again, I would just ask that all of us in uniform never forget, hold the Constitution close to your heart. That's what we are about. And remember that diversity is a strength. It's not a weakness, it's a strength, and it gives us incredible strength in combat because it builds cohesive forces, it builds good order and discipline, and that's what we're about in order to defend that great idea that's embedded in the Constitution. So thanks so much for what each and every one of you are doing every single day. Thank you, Secretary.
Let me wrap up by saying thank you once again, everybody, for tuning in and to participating in this town hall today. I know we got a lot out of it, and I hope you have as well. Secondly, I'd like to thank all of you in uniform and also our DoD civilians for your service and your sacrifice and your commitment, particularly in these challenging times. It is a difficult moment for our country dealing with the coronavirus, but you all have inspired us and held the country safe and firm, both domestically and abroad. So thank you once again for that. Third, I'd like to repeat what we've all been saying, the importance of diversity and inclusion in our ranks. We must guarantee that we treat everybody with dignity and respect and ensure that we address issues of discrimination and bias and prejudice and afford everybody an equal opportunity to reach their best and be their best. That's my commitment. That's our commitment. That's got to be the chain of command's commitment. But inevitably, it's everybody's responsibility and commitment to continue to push along these themes. Because as we said today, diversity and inclusion make us stronger, not weaker. They make us better, not worse. They are all about what we are and who we are as Americans. That's why I want to finish up with where I began, and that is, we have all sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution. It is that document that embodies those ideas we talked about today, about judging people based on their merit, not on their skin or their ethnicity or their race. It's about treating people equally. It's about giving everybody equal opportunity. It's about respecting those rights embodied in that document. That's what we're all committed to. That's what we're all willing to die for. That's certainly something we all must be willing to live for. So I encourage you, urge you to think about day in and day out as you accomplish your missions, as you go about your tasks, as you serve side by side with people, fellow service members of all races, ethnicities, genders, orientations, etc. That this is what makes America great. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, SEAC. To our online viewers, on behalf of the Department of Defense, thank you for tuning in and thank you for your questions. That concludes our virtual town hall today, July 17th.
As the director of the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases, he has conducted extensive research and work to both prevent, diagnose, and treat infectious diseases. He has advised 16 presidents on everything from HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, Zika, and now COVID-19. He is the winner of the National Medal of Science and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. We are grateful for his lifetime of public service and particularly thankful for his candor and expertise and counsel during this critical time. Let's just get right to this. Dr. Fauci, let me ask you for a broad overview of the pandemic. Where are we now?
Well, we're in obviously a difficult situation. We have now a very large outbreak. There have been, as you probably know, close to 140,000 deaths, and we have several million infections. That's the sobering news. There are some bright spots that we need to capitalize on, namely areas of the country like the New York metropolitan area, which have actually been through a very, very difficult time, probably worse than any other regional area of a big city in the world, but have turned it around and come down. But as we're seeing now, if you follow the news carefully, which is pretty obvious, that there are sections of the country, particularly a group of southern states, particularly California, Florida, Texas, and Arizona, as well as others, that are seeing a resurgence where we're seeing of the country like the New York metropolitan area, which have actually been through a very, very difficult time, probably worse than any other regional area of a big city in the world, but have turned it around and come down. But as we're seeing now, if you follow the news carefully, which is pretty obvious, that there are sections of the country, particularly a group of southern states, particularly California, Florida, Texas, and Arizona, as well as others, that are seeing a resurgence where we had a baseline of about 20,000 cases a day, has now gone up to 30, 40, 50, 60, and even 70 on the last count. So we've got to do something about that. That's something we need to address. It is a significant issue. Resurgences are things that we've got to be able to suppress because, as we all know, we want to ultimately, and as soon as we possibly can, and as safely as we possibly can, we want to reopen the country, get it back to some step-by-step direction towards normality. And the way you do that is by a careful process of opening up under certain types of guidelines that we have put out from the coronavirus White House task force. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to get back in step. I mean, I think the time has come that we really do need to take a look at what's going on and see if we can intensify the things we do to prevent the resurgences that we're seeing.
Is the virus evolving? Is it becoming less deadly, or how do you imagine it evolving? What does the fall look like?
Well, first of all, it's very difficult to predict right now because one of the things about this virus, in some respects, it's been in certain areas unpredictable. But there are certain things that are predictable, and that is if you don't do certain things and the virus is left to its own devices, it will continue to spread through the population to susceptible people. Now, you say, is the virus changing? I mean, obviously, I don't want to get too technical about it, but this is an RNA virus, and RNA viruses mutate. They always do. That's part of their natural evolution and their replication cycle. The question is, have they mutated so much as to change substantially? There's been a recent study that has not been necessarily applied in vivo to people, but has been shown in a situation where you look at the evolution and mutation of the virus in a certain way. Seems that it binds a bit better to the receptor with a certain mutation, but I don't think we can say anything about that yet from a practical clinical standpoint until we get more data. Bottom line answer to your question, that there isn't anything different about this virus that would give us any further insight into what is going to happen in the fall. I think we should, put aside thinking of the fall. People keep talking about the possibility of a second wave in the fall. That's a historic terminology related to another time and another outbreak. I think we need to concentrate on where we are right now, because if you're talking about waves, we are really essentially still in the first wave. When you're having, up to 70,000 new infections in certain areas of the country, that's something you need to focus on right now, as opposed to looking ahead at what's going to happen in September or in October.
As you know, we have some questions from our audience that I have on video here. To the first one from Ann Gill in Arizona.
Good morning, Dr. Fauci. My name is Ann Gill, and I'm the president and CEO of the Tempe Chamber of Commerce in Tempe, Arizona. And my question for you today is, did states open up too early, or was it the way that we reopened that resulted in the current spike in cases?
That's a very good question, and it is a mixed bag. I'm not going to name any individual states, but if you look at the criteria for the stepwise fashion of so-called reopening, we put out guidelines from the coronavirus task force that had what's called a gateway, which is criteria of the lessening of number of cases over a certain number of days. If you pass that gateway, you would then go to phase 1. And if you were there at a certain amount of time and the cases were steady and going down, you could go to phase 2 and phase 3. So when you look at that, clearly, there are some states that actually skipped over one or more of those, what you call benchmarks or checkpoints. That could have been one of the issues that led to the surge. There are other situations where the states and the cities essentially, officially, did it perfectly correctly. But the citizenry, the people themselves, did not abide by what those recommendations were from the state and the city. And that's what we have seen so dramatically with film clips that we've seen on TV of people congregating in crowds at bars without masks, or in crowded places without masks, be it beaches, boardwalks, or whatever. And that, in fact, almost certainly has led, at least in part, as a partial explanation, to the kind of resurgences that we've seen. So it's a mixed bag. It's doing a bit too quickly on the part of some, and they are trying to do it correctly, but people did not cooperate on the part of other locations.
We've talked a lot in the country about testing and how testing get this under control. How do you think it's hard for the United States to get effective testing in place?
Well, obviously, we got off to a slow start with regard to testing for a number of reasons that have been very much dissected considerably, so we need not go back in them now. But things right now with regard to testing clearly are much better than they were before. And if you look at the number of tests that have been done, as well as the projection over the next month or two of the number of tests that we can be able to do, I believe you're going to start to see, and hopefully we'll see, a change for the better in both the availability of the test when you get the results back more quickly than in some cases we've got them back. All of those things can certainly use a degree of improvement, but they are much better now than they were in the past.
You know, the U.S. Chamber, as you know, represents businesses of every size, every sector, every community across the country. And one of the things we hear a lot from business leaders and community leaders is, which data should we be watching? How do we know what is actionable for us? You know, where do we look for information? What would you advise those business leaders?
Well, the CDC, forever has been the lead agency in both surveillance and response to outbreaks. And you can get on a daily basis and even some real time information, not only about the extent and the location and the dynamics of the outbreak on the country as a whole, but you can also get it city by city and state by state. So I would point you to the CDC website to get the kind of information that I think would be very valuable to you. There are other websites, independent, non-government websites, that have very similar information. The Johns Hopkins website has one. There are other websites, but I would recommend that for the purposes that you're asking, that you stick with the CDC.
So this idea of advising people in their communities leads right into the next audience question, which comes from California and a gentleman named Kirk Rosberg.
Hi there. My name is Kirk Rosberg with Torrance Bakery in Torrance, California. And my question is, what is the best advice that I can give to my staff who are fearful?
What you need to do, that's a very good question, a very commonly asked question, Kurt. So you're in California. California is responding now. I mean, I know I've been in contact multiple times with your governor and with also mayors in California. The thing you do is to take a look at the state in which your particular location is. Are you at Gateway? Are you at phase 1? Are you at phase 2? And to follow the guidelines that are very clearly delineated. And all you need to go is to coronavirus.gov and you will see what are called the criteria for opening or the guidelines for opening America. Having looked at them, the minimal thing that you should do is the kinds of things that we've been talking about constantly. Wearing a mask, maintaining 6 feet of distance, avoiding crowds, washing your hands where possible as much as you can, either with soap and water or with the kinds of substances that are around in Purell or whatever the one that happens to be available to you. Those are the fundamental things that you need to do, because the virus will not be able to do anything if you keep physical distance. If you're in a bakery and you're open and therefore you have to be physically closer, wearing a mask is something everyone should do, both you, and you should ask it of your customers to also do that.
So France just mandated masks in all public indoor places. Is that something that we're going to need local and state governments to do here?
You know, I think it's going to be, as we all know, our society from the beginning of the founding fathers is a federalist society in which the states have certain prerogatives and powers and responsibilities. I can say as a public health official that I would urge the leaders, the local political and other leaders in states and cities and towns to be as forceful as possible in getting your citizenry to wear masks. Masks are important as part of the physical distance. Physical distancing is the most important. But practically, when you're living your life and trying to open up the country, you are going to come into contact with people. And for that reason, we know that masks are really important and we should be using them, everyone.
That leads directly into a question we got from this member of Michigan.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Rawl, and I am with the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce in Lansing, Michigan. Thank you, Dr. Fauci, for joining us. And my question is around masks and businesses. And today, businesses are in the unfortunate position of being the mask police. They are anxious for the revenue, but are desperate to stay healthy and open. And they often have to confront patrons who are not wearing a mask. This has led to uncomfortable and even dangerous encounters. What advice would you have for the business owners and the staff members to manage or address this situation? And what would be your message to the community at large to drive home the critical importance of wearing a mask?
Well, thank you, Michelle. The answer to the second part of your question really butts on and is probably the answer to the first part. I am totally aware, because I've spoken to so many people who are in the same situation as the commercial people in Lansing. And that is, it gets difficult when people don't want to cooperate, and you don't want to have a hostile environment in your business for obvious reasons. But on the other hand, you want to maintain the highest levels of safety. So what I have been trying to do in my discussions, and I'll mention it briefly now because I do it at every opportunity that I can, to get people to appreciate that you have both an individual responsibility to protect yourself. Because if you get infected, even if you're a young person and have a higher chance of not having a serious outcome, by getting infected, even if you never get symptoms, that you are part of the propagation of the pandemic. So even though deep down you want to open up the country and you want to get back to normal, by getting infected, you are propagating the process of the pandemic, and you are slowing down the process of opening up. Because even though you think it only involves you in a vacuum, it doesn't. Because if you get infected, the chances are you're going to infect someone else. And the chances that person is going to infect someone else. And then sooner or later, probably sooner, you're going to infect someone who is a vulnerable person who could get seriously ill. That could be someone's grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, a child on chemotherapy for leukemia, a woman getting radiation or chemotherapy for breast cancer, all of the kinds of people that are at higher risk of a serious outcome. So we need to try to engender, all of us, a feeling of both personal and societal responsibility. So it isn't just, I don't want to wear a mask when I go into your place to buy a loaf of bread or whatever it is that you're going to buy, because I don't want anybody telling me what to do. I understand that. We have a spirit of independence in our country that was there from the very birth of our country. But this is really different. This is everybody pulling together in a very serious situation. If we could get more people to understand that, hopefully we'll get more people who'd be willing to wear masks.
Speaking of being a good public citizen and personal and civic responsibility, a number of chamber leaders and business leaders play other roles in their communities. They tend to be thought leaders and volunteers. And a number of them are being called on, a number of the people in this audience are being called on by their local school boards and their local government officials to help grapple with how, when to open schools. And so speaking kind of specifically to thought leaders in communities across the country, how should they be participating in those conversations, and what factors should they be considering on the ground?
Yeah, a very important point that you bring up, because this is obviously being discussed intensively as we get into the summer and prepare for the end of the summer and the early fall, particularly when children in lower intermediate and high school will be going back to school, but particularly children who are going into lower or elementary schools, as we used to call it. So my advice is that we need to first take a look, go to 40,000 feet and look at the big picture. If you look at things that come out from the American Academy of Pediatrics, if you look at the well-known downstream unintended consequences that are ripple effects of keeping children out of school, namely the impact on the kids themselves, the impact logistically on the parents because of the fact that it impacts their ability to go to work, that the default position should always be we need to do as best as we possibly can within the framework of safety, but the best we possibly can to have our default position to get the children back to school. Having said that, living in a big country that is geographically and demographically diverse, that we are not unidimensional. There'll be parts of the country where the level of virus activity is so low that you don't have to modify anything at all. Just send the children back to school. But clearly, if you just look at what's going on right now, there are parts of the country that have a significant degree of viral activity that make you want to pause and say, okay, wait a minute. If we are going to bring the children back to school, we've got to make sure that paramount is safety for the children and safety for the teachers. So we may want to modify logistically or otherwise what we do. Separate the desks by a certain amount, wearing masks for children within an age group in which masks are at least feasible, perhaps rotating the kinds of schedule, morning, afternoon, every other day, or what have you. Always thinking we're going to do whatever we can to get the schools open and the children back to school. But always remember that safety and the health of the children and the teachers comes first. And I think if we keep that in mind, we'll go a long way to getting the schools open safely.
We were, it's a summer of interns, and there's always a summer of interns. We're all trying to help our interns have different experiences this year, given how complicated the virus has made it. And we have an intern who asked the question, are schools ever going to go back to normal, to the way that they were?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, we're going to get over this. It seems, we've been going through this very difficult period for the last 5.5, 6 months. And sometimes you get so exasperated and run down by it that you think it's never going to end. It will end. It will end through public health measures, and science, I can tell you, will come to our rescue. Hopefully sooner rather than later. We're going as fast as we possibly can with the development of therapeutics and the development of a vaccine, which, as you know, we've been speaking about a while. We've got some pretty favorable results in early studies of vaccines. One of the candidates will be going into an advanced phase 3 trial by the end of this month, by the end of July. And other candidates will be entering advanced clinical trials as we get into the midsummer, late summer, and early fall. So we feel cautiously optimistic that we are on the road, as bleak as it may sound right now, that we are on the road of getting this under control. So you can tell your intern, yes, we will get back to normal with schools, and we will ultimately get back to normal with every other aspect of our lives.
That's a wonderful thing, I think, for us all to center on and to make us all more serious about masks and social distancing and washing our hands, because there is a normal on the other side, and probably the sooner we can interact appropriately, the better. That's an optimistic note. Let me ask you a question on another optimistic note, which is we hear a lot about how the virus has impacted business, but it's also true that business has impacted the virus. And so you just talked about vaccines. We know there are therapeutics and there are other things, but can you talk a little bit about the role of the private sector in fighting this pandemic?
The role of the private sector is paramount. The federal government, academia, is part of the private sector. Pharmaceutical companies are part of the private sector. So every single candidate, therapeutic, diagnostic, and certainly vaccine that we're dealing with right now and trying to develop has a major input from the private sector. So there's no way government alone, be it a federal government or state and local government, is going to fix this. It's a marriage and a collaboration between government authorities and the private sector. It has always been that way. It is that way now. And I believe it always will be that way. So the answer to your question is absolutely the private sector plays a major role.
You mentioned, and the Chamber is obviously a firm believer in that and the role of the private sector and how important it is, but also how these public-private partnerships across a lot of society's challenges are so important to success for all of us. And speaking of other partnerships, we have another question from the audience from yet another sector. You mentioned academia. We have a question here from Enid Raymer, who I think is at Johns Hopkins.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Fauci. My name is Ina Chung Raymer. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for Health and Productivity Studies from Johns Hopkins. My question is, how can the business community best help achieve public health priorities in improving the public health infrastructure needs to manage the current crisis?
Well, you make, a good point. I'm expecting that coming from Hopkins that you would do that. And that is, I'll put in a plug here for something that I want everybody to appreciate, is that one of the most important aspects of responding to an outbreak are both the healthcare infrastructure locally and the public health infrastructure locally. It becomes very, very difficult to adequately respond, including things like identification, isolation, contact tracing, if you do not have an adequate local public health infrastructure, manpower, and capability. And unfortunately, in some respects, historically, we have been the victims of our own success because we've done so well in containing, controlling, and even eliminating some of the big killers and maimers and diseases that cause a great degree of morbidity over the decades and decades, that we have, maybe declared our success too prematurely and let the local public health capability kind of dwindle a bit. So that's something we need to build up now, but we need to remember in the future that if we want to respond adequately to an outbreak, we really need to make sure that our local public health apparatus is very much intact and very vital and very ready to respond.
Well, that makes me want to ask you 12 questions. I'll try to limit it to one at a time here. You mentioned the importance of the local infrastructure and the domestic infrastructure, but as we're seeing these global pandemics, of course, there's an international infrastructure, and there's been a lot of conversation about the World Health Organization and why it's important that the United States have a connection with these global health organizations. Can you explain that?
Well, I think if you look at the meaning, the Latin-derived meaning of pandemic, it's pan meaning all. So when you're dealing with an infectious disease, this is a global issue by definition. There are very, very few, I think Ebola may be one of them, where you have an infectious disease that just by the nature of the disease itself is combined geographically. But when you get a respiratory illness, which most pandemics are, influenza, COVID, respiratory illnesses, then by definition, you're global, particularly in the 20th century, 21st century, where we in fact wind up being able to travel from one part of the globe around the world 180 degrees around in 18 hours. So you have to look at the global connectivity. And that's the reason why organizations that are global in nature, as well as the public health security networks that we have put up, are so important because we are all connected, and we need to be connected and be transparent. We need to be connected to exchange information, and we need to be connected in our response. Because if you have something like a COVID-19 outbreak, if it's smoldering in another part of the world, we're vulnerable here. I mean, we saw that absolutely when it emerged in a well-defined geographic area in China. And then all of a sudden, the entire world with more than 220 countries have been involved. So that's the answer to your question. It is global by nature, so we need global organizations and global cooperation.
The other thing your earlier answer made me think about is you mentioned the successes we've had in combating other diseases. And it made me think about how important immunity is to that at some point. And so these questions about COVID-19, and I know that we don't know the answers, but what do you think the odds are that people could get reinfected, that you could get this virus over and over again? And how does that change how we treat this particular disease?
Well, first of all, we don't know the answer to that question. You're absolutely right. We can make some extrapolations based on a long backlog of knowledge of other viruses, that if you get infected and you recover, which almost by definition means you've made an adequate immune response against the virus and recovered from the virus, and that virus does not substantially change, so it's the same virus, that the chances are that at least for a finite period of time, and we don't know now today what the definition for finite means. Is it 3 months, 6 months, a year? We don't know that yet. We're learning that, but we don't know that yet. You can assume that you're going to be protected for some period of time after you recover. The question that we need to know for the purpose, for example, of vaccinations is how long does that protection last? Because it will guide us to get the optimal vaccination. I mean, you vaccinate someone, you hope you get a response that protects them for X amount of months or years, you hope. Likely we'll be able to do that. If the immunity wanes the way immunity does wane with some infections and with some vaccinations, the response is you do something like give a booster shot, which is something that is not that difficult to do. So you need to be aware of the potential finite nature of protection, but there are also multiple ways that you could overcome that and respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, we're all used to getting boosters, right? I mean, that's something that happens as we vaccinate our children and ourselves, and you just learn how often you need them. That becomes part of how you take care of yourself. We have another question coming in from Hope Cupid in Virginia.
Good morning, Dr. Fauci. My name is Hope Cupid, President and CEO of Southeast RCAP. My question for you today is, why is COVID-19 impacting Black and Brown people disproportionately, and what does this demographic need to know to better protect themselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Hope, for that extraordinarily relevant question, because this is a real problem that we're facing. So if you look at the data, what you said is absolutely correct. If you look at minority populations, particularly African Americans, Latinx to some extent too, Native Americans, that there are two things that go on with them that make them bear a disproportionately more serious burden of COVID-19. And that is, even though you don't like to generalize, but in this case, generalization makes you understand it better, that in general, the kinds of jobs and the kind of economic strata in which minority populations, particularly African Americans, find themselves in, put them in a more vulnerable position to get infected. It's less likely, by the jobs that many of them have, that they're able to protect themselves by being at home, doing work through telework, looking at a computer and being safe in your own home. Generally, they are disproportionately more out there, exposed in situations where they may not be able to prevent themselves from getting infected. So their risk of getting infected is likely more. Not major studies, but they get infected more. So therefore, you can make a reasonable assumption that the risk they have of getting infected is more. Then the important issue that's more problematic, because it's going to take a much longer time to address and fix, and that is the social determinants of disease that things that go into making someone have a higher incidence of diabetes, of hypertension, of obesity, of asthma, of any of a variety of illnesses, which we know if you do get infected and you have one of those underlying conditions, that the chances of your getting a serious, deleterious, negative outcome of getting infected is much greater than if you didn't have those underlying conditions. So when you look at the African American and the minority population in general, they have a significantly higher incidence of those underlying conditions that lead to a poor outcome. So when you put those things together, greater incidence of getting infected, greater prevalence and incidence of comorbidities, which make your outcome worse, it's entirely easy to understand the data that you just mentioned, that the minority communities are at much greater risk of getting into trouble with COVID-19. You can address some of them immediately by putting resources for better and easier testing, identification, isolation, contact tracing in areas where there's demographic overrepresentation of this minority. So they have easy accessibility to these things to get them diagnosed and into care quickly. We can do that now. What's going to take longer to fix is the decades and decades and decades old social determinants of health, which we must address because they can be overcome, and over a period of time, we can diminish that disparity of these underlying conditions in the minority population.
It's such an important point. You know, one of the pieces of work we do at the Chamber is doing everything we can to support job creators. And we just held a national town hall about what we can do to impact the equality of opportunity, because we know that employment leads to better health outcomes. And so we know that whatever we can do to help people who've been traditionally...
Absolutely need to get tested. If you want to get tested, there are enough tests around that you can get tested. But there may be good reasons why you want to get tested. And that would be, I think, something to drive you to get tested. The other thing that I think is important is depending upon where you and a facilitation of opening. Because if you follow them, it is unlikely you will have to backtrack because of a surge, the way we're seeing going on in several states right now. So if you do it prudently, then I believe you can, in most instances, continue to progress along to bringing back and opening up America again.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for everything you're doing for our country. Thank you for helping us think.
Sadowski Coalition, and my comments are that we cannot say enough good about Governor DeSantis and his support for affordable housing. As soon as he came into office, he put in his budget full appropriation for the state and local housing trust funds. And then he did it again in the second year. And now he's taken $250 million out of the CARES Fund and directed it to help people with housing between now and the end of the year. So we have also a great gratitude in the way it's being done with the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, because the money is being administered through the SHIP programs. That's very important, because our SHIP administrators immediately launched into action as soon as the governor declared the disaster, and they reprogrammed their SHIP monies to use it the way the CARES money can be used for rental assistance, for mortgage foreclosure prevention. And now, with the announcement that the governor's made today, they'll be able to use federal money for that and use their SHIP money for the SHIP activities, which are so critical and which we will get back to again in the beginning of January 2021. I just cannot express enough how grateful we are to have a governor who really is a housing champion. Thank you.
Oh yeah, we'll hand that. Mayor, this is for you. 7 million big ones right there.
We get thumbs up?
All right, thank you. You can come back anytime. Well, we look forward to that unemployment rate getting back where we want it, and we really view Central Florida as such an important engine for the state. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks for all that they've been doing, to help these folks. I have a number of updates in terms of the COVID-19. I've been working with the president and the vice president, as well as other members of the administration, to accelerate more of the treatment remdesivir. It's a drug that has been used to treat people who come in with COVID-like illnesses. Most of the physicians I've spoken to around the state believe that it has been effective at reducing hospital stays and taking a patient who would be on the verge of going to an ICU if they were left unabated, and keeping them in a more stable condition. We expedited a shipment last weekend, as people thought, as hospitals said they were running low. They want more, which we want to help deliver on. So the White House is accelerating more remdesivir to the state of Florida. We think it's going to ship this weekend, and obviously we'll be working with all the hospitals. It will go directly from the distributor to the hospital, so the state's not going to be involved in parceling it out. But I really want to thank the president, the vice president, for understanding that this is something that's important for people in the state of Florida, for some of our patients who've gone into the hospital, and doing all they can to be able to accelerate that. I also spoke with the head of the company who makes it, Gilead, and they are working to continue to crank out these medications, and so we appreciate them for doing that. I also want to just make a point about hospital capacity. You'll see these different headlines saying there's no capacity here or there. Just understand, we have 21% of the beds statewide are available. That's a greater percentage than was available in early March before the pandemic took off. I mean, typically hospitals run at 90% or 88, 90%. That's how they stay in business. And so now we have less than 80% of the beds are actually in use. So there is capacity. And particularly, I think this is important, because what we saw in March and April, and part of it was the fear of the coronavirus, but I think part of it was people didn't think that they could be seen at a hospital because there was a narrative that somehow the hospitals didn't have capacity. That was obviously not true in Florida then. And so people that had heart or stroke, they deferred going into the ED, deferred seeking treatment, and that was big numbers across the country. That has led to more significant conditions now. So I've spoken to physicians here in Florida, and there are patients, not for COVID, but they're in ICUs who have more significant ailments as a result of deferring care, and I think you're seeing that across the country. So if you need care, seek care. There's not a single hospital CEO that I've spoken to that has said, don't send anybody here. They say, this is our job, and we're going to do it. They also have the ability, they have capacity. One of the things that has been an issue is just making sure you have enough personnel. So the state, we've sent hundreds of medical personnel to different parts of the state, particularly the Miami-Dade County, and we're going to continue to be supportive in that regard. Part of it is just the fact that as you go along with this, as there's community transmission, some of the staff can get infected, and obviously that's something that would put somebody on the sidelines potentially. So having this personnel is very important, and so we're supportive of that. I also think the federal government's going to be sending some teams to supplement, and potentially the Department of Veterans Affairs. I spoke with the Secretary the other day, so we anticipate support there. But the bottom line is, we have capacity, we have the ability to care for people, and COVID, while it's important, that's just a fraction of the people that are in hospitals on any given day, and all those other conditions also need attention as well. Our long-term care support is ongoing. Those long-term care residents, about 150,000 long-term care residents in the state of Florida, mostly in their 70s and 80s. Most of them have health problems. They represent, from just that community, almost 50% of the COVID-related fatalities in the state of Florida. And so they're the most at-risk group. We've obviously done a lot in terms of not letting visitation, not letting sick patients be discharged back into nursing homes, sending PPE, requiring PPE. We've tested all the nursing homes, and all those things are good. We have set up, now we have even expanded number of COVID-only nursing homes, so that if somebody is in the hospital and they're contagious but they don't need hospital level of care, they can be discharged to this COVID-only facility where they'll be appropriately isolated. Or if they're in their nursing home and they test positive, but they don't need to go to the hospital, leaving them there could spread it to other people, so you have a place to be able to transfer. So we have over 1,000 beds operational throughout the state for COVID-only nursing homes. 2 sites are operational in Brevard County, 1 site here in Orlando, and there's going to be another one added in Orange County next week. So by the time some of the additional beds come on, and we have many beds in southern Florida, you're looking at probably close to 1,800 beds that will be in these COVID-only facilities, serving as a step up from a nursing home and a step down from the hospital. That's a way to keep the spread from spreading in these nursing homes and long-term care facilities, which is our most vulnerable population. Testing has been going through the roof in the state of Florida. I mean, you hear about the positive tests, which obviously that's part of it, but the number of tests being conducted are unlike anything we thought we would be able to accomplish. We've averaged over the last 7 days over 100,000 tests a day. And when we were in the height of the March and April, we were doing between 7,500 and 10,000 tests a day. When we went into May with our phase 1, we said we want to accelerate testing. We want to get more testing out there, and our goal was about 30,000 a day. So now we're doing 100,000. Part of that is because of our long-term care testing, but this is an inordinate amount of testing. I think what we're seeing is the percentage of new cases that are positive has stabilized, and even maybe slightly down from where it was 2 weeks ago, where we were pretty much 14 to 16%. Now we are probably more of like 12, 13%. And here in Central Florida, they're below the state average. I mean, you've had Orange County has been in that 10, even a little lower. Brevard has been back in the single digits. They used to be 2%, and then they started getting in double digits. Lake has been around that 10% mark, a little less than that. Seminole, I think, is stabilized, and hopefully will be going back down into single digits. So we definitely have seen stabilization. Even in southern Florida, we've seen stabilization in terms of the percentage of people who are testing positive. Obviously, we want to go back to where we were in May and the beginning of June, where we had a lot of places around the state that were testing 3-4% positivity. I mean, you figure 1 or 2% may just be false positives. So if you get in there, you're in really good shape. We also are working to accelerate test results for people. These commercial labs, by and large, will tell you, if you get them a sample, they'll turn it around in 48 hours. But I think in practice, what we've seen, there are people go through our drive-through sites, and sometimes they don't get results for 7 to 10 days. So just think about, even from their perspective, you just wait and wait and wait. That's not ideal for a patient, of course. It's also not good for medical professionals because they don't have an answer about whether somebody is actually infected or not. And so you assume they are if they're in the hospital as a PUI, and so it's just not a good situation. We have, the Department of Emergency Management has severed ties with one of the labs who was taking a week, diverting that business from our drive-through sites to labs who pledged to do better. We're just going to keep monitoring, but at the end of the day, if you pledge to do a certain number of turnaround, we want to see that because it's really important that the folks who are getting tested get an answer in a decent interval. What we've rolled out today along those lines, and this is happening at the Orange County Convention Center here in Central Florida. It's also happening in Fort Lauderdale, in Miami-Dade, and then in Jacksonville at the Regency Mall, is for symptomatic people, because remember, a lot of the people who are testing now would not have been tested in March. A lot of them may have been exposed, but they don't necessarily have symptoms. But the people that have symptoms, obviously, those are the ones that we really need the results back as quickly as possible. So for those folks who've developed the COVID symptoms, there's going to be lanes where you can go in, utilize a self-swab, send it to, we have a couple companies who have a good track record, and the goal is to get that turned around much quicker than what we've been seeing in some of these other commercial labs. So that starts today. We're obviously going to monitor the data on that and really hold people accountable. But I can tell you, we've had a lot of luck dealing with one of these companies with our long-term care testing. Typically that will get sent and we'll get a result by the time the lab receives the specimen in under 30 hours. And so that's a really good turnaround time. So we're going to be looking at that because we know it's important. We've also, the State Department of Emergency Management has put out new retail sites at Home Depots. So we have 4 new sites that have come online: Tallahassee, Leesburg, Jacksonville, and Oviedo. So you have 2 right here in Central Florida at the Home Depots, and those are just, now if you're shopping, you want to get tested, you can, and I know a lot of people have been taking advantage of that. When you're looking at the test numbers and the positivity and all that, it is very important to scrutinize that in terms of the age groups, because we know the coronavirus disproportionately impacts folks who are elderly. And not just 65 and older, really, as you get into 75 and 85, that changes dramatically even there. And so when you're seeing positive tests come from 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, it's important to point out, absent a significant underlying health issue, those folks are typically asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, and very few require hospitalization. And so those numbers just need context. And here's, I think, part of what is driving the positivity. For the whole pandemic, the positivity rate for people 18 to 24, and really most of that bulk is kind of that 21, 22, is 17%. On the other hand, 65 to 84 is 6.5% positivity. And so it's those elderly folks are most vulnerable that we really need to protect. That is the most important cohort. Obviously, we'd like to see everybody have as low positivity as possible, but the younger folks, are still driving not only the case numbers, but really also helping to drive the positivity. And that really brings us to kind of going forward. Protecting our most vulnerable is the best way for us to reduce mortality and morbidity. If you look at the case fatality rate in Florida, it's about 1.5%. The national average is about 4%. Many of the other states, particularly in the Northeast, are 5, 6, 7% case fatality rates. We obviously want to continue to have as low as we can, and a lot of that just depends on making sure the nursing homes have support, and then our 65 and older community, which we have seen exercise a lot of care and caution throughout the whole pandemic. But our advisory from March has always been to avoid crowds and minimize close contact with individuals outside the home. If you are in that 65 and up category, or if you're somebody that does have a significant underlying condition, our long-term care residents, we're protecting by continuing a lot of the things that we've done, but now we're testing all the staff every 2 weeks. So that's 200,000 people that work at over 4,000 long-term care facilities throughout the state of Florida. We've now had samples taken from all 200,000 over the last 2 weeks. This is kind of our first week doing that after we had gone through and tested everybody over a couple month period. And unfortunately, their people test positive. Fortunately, the rate of positive is significantly lower than statewide. It's been a little under 3%. When they test positive, they're isolated. Then any residents who came in contact with them are obviously given an opportunity to test, and they're monitored for symptoms. So that's an important way to keep COVID from really spreading in the most vulnerable areas. And I will just end by saying this. We are seeing some positive trends in the data. If you look at Orange County and some of the Central Florida areas, they've seen their positivity stabilize and decline. I think it's going to decline a lot more, but that's where it is. Visits to emergency departments for COVID-like illnesses have declined for 7 days here in the state of Florida, and that is really a leading indicator about people who are going to be admitted or not admitted to hospitals. So I think that we're in a point where the testing has been relatively stable, and we're testing a lot, obviously. The ED visits, there's a downward trend on that. So I think if we can kind of keep doing the basic things that they're doing here in other parts of the state, that's really going to help us get through the next 2 weeks. And so for anyone who's in those vulnerable groups, 65 and plus, just understand some of those younger cohorts, the people in their 20s and 30s, this is circulating more significantly in those age groups than it would be in some of the other age groups. And so, as you limit your contact, keep that in mind and do the best that you can to protect yourself, because we want to make sure we get through this in the best possible shape that we can. With that, take some questions.
Governor, the Orange County School Board just voted for their innovation plan.
I'll do one at a time. Yes, sir.
There was an unpublished report from the White House about the coronavirus task force saying there were hotbed states such as Florida recommend closing bars. I know our bars are already closed. It also recommends gyms. It says this report was given to all the governors. What is your stance after that report about Florida being a hotbed, and do you have any suggestions?
Well, obviously, I think if you look at the Sun Belt, we've all seen the same movement in terms of increased prevalence. I think the fact that we're testing so much has led to case numbers that have been put out there, and I think kind of unfairly, maligning the state as being something. If some of those states like New York and New Jersey were testing 100,000 a day at their height, they would have had 40,000 or 50,000 cases a day. So I think it's important to put that in perspective. But there's no doubt that we've seen from Southern California to South Carolina, including Florida, Texas, Arizona, we've seen an increase of spread, and obviously, as I mentioned, a lot of spread with some of the younger folks. And so with the pubs, they've never been open in Southern Florida. So just put that. And then when we did the phase 2, it was basically they had to do similar to a restaurant, the limited capacity and the seating. And when people followed the guidelines, never had any problems, but obviously there was an issue with a lot of non-compliance, and so that's why they ended up doing that. In terms of the gyms, we've not had a lot of problems with that, and so that's not something that I'm gonna close. Partially because if you look, you talk to any physician, particularly the people that are under 50, if you're in good shape, you have a very, very low likelihood of ending up in significant condition as a result of the coronavirus. The people that they're seeing in there have overwhelmingly uncontrolled comorbidities. A lot of folks have hypertension, diabetes, are very morbidly obese. And so I think taking that option away for people to be healthy just doesn't make sense. And we haven't really seen that as a major vector. I know it could be theoretically. Anything you do theoretically could do it. But I think most of the people that are going to gyms are in the low-risk groups. And I think what they're doing is making them even less risk for the coronavirus. I don't think it makes sense to close it. Yes, ma'am.
The Orange County School District just voted to put their plan forward, but what they want is some community control, that if the numbers don't back down, that they could not open those brick and mortar schools. Would you back that decision? And if you did, would you put more money into those kinds of districts for online?
So what I've said from the beginning is we got to work with every community as we see their circumstances. And The state is very diverse anyways, but if you look at how the epidemic has unfolded, it's not unfolded evenly across the state. I think that, quite frankly, I think Central Florida, as we get into next month, probably in pretty good shape, just based on the trends I see. That's what I hope. But obviously, they need to have the ability to to make decisions, and the parents' input is going to be important. One of my overriding principles is that parents should have options. And if they choose distance learning because they're not comfortable in a school setting, then that's for them. If there are parents that really want to have some in-person instruction, I think school districts should do whatever they can to provide that, particularly for our very young students. I think one of the things that we're really concerned about is some of the learning gaps that will develop in the K through 5. And when you're doing that, when you're falling behind in reading especially, that could have a lifetime of effects. And so for me, I look particularly at those elementary school kids, and the science on that is just overwhelming. Yes, they're at almost zero risk, but even more than that, transmission from an elementary school to an adult is extremely rare. I think generally for schools, the kids aren't vectors. As you get into 17, 18, I think you can probably find some examples of that. But man, those primary school kids, I really am concerned about having to do that. But I've told all the school districts, look, this is a team effort. You represent different constituencies. You have different things happening in your community. So we just need to be sensitive to that. But we also need to be sensitive to the harm that will come if, while of course giving parents the ability to opt for distance, if you shut out those parents who really believe it's important to get some in-person instruction. And I think most of these folks in the schools, I think most of them want to be there because they realize how important it is. Safety is important, but we also need to really look at the data and let the facts drive it. I do not think that we should be swept up in fear. I think there's a lot of fear out there, and obviously that's risk for the mill, and that is stoked. But I think we just look at the situation, we can figure out, how to get this done. I'm confident of that. We've got a lot of great talented people working in our school system, and so, we'll be working with them. But this is an evolving situation, and I think folks understand that.
So that's a yes?
Something similar to what was done for first responders, healthcare workers at first. Would you consider a state-funded testing site just for educators, bus drivers, and school administrators during the school year?
Of course we would, but I would also just say what we found with this testing is, there's a limited utility in testing healthy people. We thought you test healthy people without symptoms, you identify that they're positive, you isolate them, and that stops the spread. The problem is if they don't get the results back for 7 days, then are they going to isolate in the meantime if they have no symptoms whatsoever? If you're just randomly testing people or you're doing it periodically, we do it in the long-term care facilities just because if that gets in there, just the chance of something happening is so. But just from the general public, I'm not sure how much it's actually been effective. So I obviously would want to offer support in any way we can, but I think that one of the things that's problematic about it is you can test positive 30 days after an infection. So the virus is dead, you're not infectious, but it can pick up the RNA. And so what? You're going to be 2 weeks not being allowed to leave your house when you're really not even infectious. So how you do that, I think we need to really discuss what makes the most sense. We went into mass testing, and look, I was one of the biggest advocates for it. A lot of what they've done in other countries is really the symptom-based testing, and it's not clear to me that they're worse off than doing what we're doing. So the answer is yes, we would definitely help, but I think we have to, as we get through this cycle and get on the other side of this hump, we've probably got to discuss what makes the most sense with testing. Because one of the things I fear is you go get tested, it's your turn to get tested, let's say, and you get a result back in a week and it's negative. But then 2 days before you got the result back, you got infected. And so these negative results for healthy people it is not a clean bill of health infinitum. Now, we are doing more and more antibody testing, and I would definitely recommend. We have a lot of first responders, healthcare workers who've been doing it. We opened it up to the general public at some of our sites, including Orange County Convention Center, and the numbers over the last week, have really gone up, which is a good sign because that means there's more immunity built up in the population. I think the numbers from yesterday, I think 14.7% tested positive for antibodies, and I think once you get in that 15% seroprevalence, that contributes to resistance of this thing being spread. So antibody testing, I think, needs to be a part of the equation, and I just think we need to recognize the limits of what PCR testing can do. There's the rapid tests that were developed. The problem with some of them is, one, there's just not enough to go around, and so I have money. If I could order them, I would, but they're mostly going to hospitals. But even some of the hospitals have seen some of them have not been accurate. They've had false positives or false negatives, and so that's a problem. I mean, we've had this one test we're doing at this mobile RV lab. It's a 45-minute test, but what happens is 5% are false positives. So when you test positive, they have to rerun the sample and sometimes take another sample to confirm it. So that's not ideal because the last thing you want is for someone to think they have it when they actually don't. So there's a whole bunch of stuff I think we're learning about this testing, and but I'm definitely not one that thinks that every student has to be tested every week or anything like that. It's just, I think functionally it wouldn't work. So I think if someone develops a symptom, a student, obviously they isolate, they stay home, then you should test them immediately, and then you can do the contact tracing. I mean, that is going to be the most effective use of what we're doing.
That's why I think you talked about the Secretary Corcoran's mandate suggesting that it was a recommendation. Do you agree with that right now, and what do you think about Orange County's plan?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at Orange County's plan, but I think what he was trying to do is say, the goal should be to get kids back in the classroom, and we want people thinking along those lines. But, the way it's structured, if you actually look at the way it's structured, it's not exactly mandatory. I know it's like the Department of Health has to do this, all this other stuff. So I think what it's doing is just focusing people on what's this going to look like and going forward. And so, but I've said many times, because I just believe being in a diverse state, you have to do it. You got to be sensitive to the different communities and what they're dealing with. But I believe Orange County could certainly offer in person, given the trend that they're on, and I think they'll be in pretty good shape by next month. I mean, they've just, Orange County has one of the lowest case fatality rates for a county this size. I think it's less than 0.5%. Now, obviously, you don't want to have any fatalities, and so anytime you see that, it's difficult and it's tragedy. But I tell you, you look at some of these other places around the country, some of these counties have 10%, case fatality, and I think that they've really done a good job here.
Are you saying there'll be no penalties for a school district that doesn't open in person?
Look, my goal is not to penalize people. My goal is to give our kids opportunity and recognize that when we talk about the coronavirus, it's very important. But in terms of everything, all the effects of it, there's been so many effects on people who probably don't even know anyone that's ever been affected, and particularly our kids. The distance learning, as good as Florida's system is compared to other states in the country, the distance learning is not the same. There is an academic gap that has developed. And look, we were in a very difficult situation in March. People didn't know whether this thing was, whether kids were big vectors. I think it was pretty obvious that the kids were lower risk, but there was still, data was coming in on that. Now we have more information, and my thing is just, for parents who have any type of misgivings, obviously, I think it'd be so counterproductive to tell them you have to go in person. I mean, it wouldn't even work. It's not the right thing to do. They have the ability to opt, but I also think we do have to be sensitive to parents who really believe that the school experience is important for their kids. And so we've got to do whatever we can to kind of meet that. But I think that's just got to be done because it's the right thing to do. I mean, to get into a tit for tat and to do that in the midst of a crisis, that's not what I'm looking to do. I mean, I want to work collaboratively with people, and I just want opportunities for our kids I do not want people falling behind. I'm concerned about what will happen. I'm concerned about just being able to be a part of the school community, having that deprived of the kids. I'm concerned about not having activities, being in the band, doing theater, playing sports. We're out looking at, our athletes, they need to be able to be out there. So there's all these different things. But I think that to be in a situation where you're trying to penalize or not, probably not the way to go.
Governor, we've had nearly 5,000 fatalities in the state. Do you take responsibility for any of those deaths?
Well, I think every time you have fatalities for any reason, I think it's a tragedy. And, we certainly have seen fatalities in Florida, particularly, recently we've seen fatalities, particularly places down in Miami-Dade. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. I also think, though, that because of our efforts, if you compare how we handle our most vulnerable population with our long-term care facilities by limiting access immediately, by having PPE, we were the only state sending massive shipments of PPE to our long-term care facilities. I dispatched the National Guard to test the residents. We've got 4,000 facilities to test that. We've put in a huge effort to test the staff so that we can catch infections before they spread. And I guarantee you, had we not done that, we would have had thousands of more of our most vulnerable would have passed away. And had we done policies like were done in some of the other states where they were forcing the nursing homes to have infectious patients, it would have been way, way worse. And so I think the efforts have been targeted. I think the efforts have definitely saved lives. We're not out of the woods, obviously, and I think it's a difficult situation. But would you rather have our case fatality rate, our deaths per million, which are lower than many of these other states, which many of them are hailed as successes just because the virus is burnt out there. But I think we've really focused on our most vulnerable, on our senior citizens generally, but particularly, those folks in our long-term care
Well,
facilities.
we're not talking about other states. We're talking about our state. Do you take responsibility for any of those deaths?
Thanks, guys. We'll see you. We'll be back soon.
Governor, do you take responsibility for the deaths that we've had? And what about the hospital